Absolutely makes sense, and really good point again about having a spike, a sprint ahead. So try not to put your spike for the work within the sprint, because then you're just doing parallel activities. So it's basically researching while doing the work. So that sometimes becomes an anti-pattern. Great. All right. So one of the question that we had from our audience from last time, but before I jump to that, we talked about story moving from one sprint to another, right? One of the questions people ask and teams ask the scrum master, and a lot of times new scrum master didn't know what to do about it, is do you carry all the points of the story to the next sprint? Or like in the last part, Awais mentioned one of the anti-patterns is if it was 5 point story and it's moving to the next sprint, most of the work is done. In the next sprint, they move the story and they call it a one pointer. So what do you do, Reha? How do you handle that situation? Do the story points move with it? Do the story points split or leave back the story points? How do you deal with it?
It's important that again boils down to the acceptance criteria, right? There was a certain acceptance criteria against which the points or the story was sized. We should be revisiting that acceptance criteria and trying and seeing what part of that were there a couple of was there a scenario which was delivered.
Yeah.
Problem with spilling over is usually what I've noticed and in my experience is that the spillover is between the dev part being completed and moving the test to the next sprint, right? Which we call out of sprint testing, which typically happens. So that's the more difficult part. The easier part is that a piece of the story was done. Chances are it's not tested. That is why it is spilling over into the next sprint, right? So it's important that you look at the amount of work which was done, what was accomplished. A story which has been developed and not being tested is not a done story. Do not
Yeah.
split it. The entire story should move into the next iteration because just writing lines of code is not work. Testing those lines of code is work, right? And that is one of the reasons we try and follow the given when then. We try and follow the testing first mindset. So those are some things which you have to be mindful of. But I would say look at the acceptance criteria. Chances are technically you've not done any piece of the story because it's not being tested. So I
Right.
would say yes, you would have to size it again and just points would move.
Points would move, absolutely. And a great point from our audience. I used to clone the user story and keep the story points for that piece. And this is specifically important. I remember a few years ago when we were using version 1. This is very important for version 1 purposes because if you just move the story, the report, if you are looking at the reports from every sprint, last sprint will say 100% of the work was done, but technically you just moved the story. So leave that story there, clone a story, move the new story to the next sprint. Great point, Eduardo. Thank you for that. All right, our last question. And we still have few questions in the chat column, but last question from the last time is let's talk about burn up versus burn down at team iteration level. So Reha, what are the differences or ways? Let's talk about burn up and burn down. What are the difference? What are the differences between burn up and burn down? And what are these charts? What are these charts used at iteration level?
Like the fundamental difference is where on different scenarios where you'll use this, right? So I think we can also find this information very clearly. But a major piece of difference in terms of implementation of burn up and burn down chat is look at the team, and we need to look at the team and the project which is in place. If the project is pretty much of a fixed scope, a burn down chart would make more sense. But if you feel a lot of changes are happening during the initiative itself, then a burn up chart would make more sense because the fundamental difference is the burn up chart will show you any scope which is added, right? So added scope, things like that can be very very easily shown up, and we can measure it in a burn up chart. Again, the scrum masters, they need to be as change agents. What they can do is look at the history of the team, look at the executives. It varies from environment to environment,
Yeah.
but if we understand what is the crux of burn up and burn down charts, right, and we can use it in the right scenarios. Ultimately, the metrics are to be used to tell a story, and we just need to make sure that we are telling the correct story and it is having the right impact.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point for people using these charts and just printing them out and showing to leadership. Most of these times, like your charts are not showing the complete picture.
Mhm.
So I know one of my teams, what they started using is they made a template,
Mhm.
and every time they have a chart about how many stories they completed versus committed to, etc. They have a questionnaire about why was that story not completed, so at least to give a good context behind it. um
Mhm.
Reha, do you want to add something to burn up versus burn down? Is there, like, I know burn down is the most common one, from at least from what I know. Is there any good scenario where people should be using burn ups, or it doesn't really matter?
No, it does. And it essentially depends on what is the choice or what you're trying to fulfill or what are you trying to achieve, right? The burn down charts basically track how much work is left out at any given moment. So you'll essentially see the x-axis, which is going to donate, or the horizontal axis going to denote the number of days which are remaining, and the y-axis will show you the points. And what you see is day one, the points will be really high, and there is a trending, or there is a expected ideal line, which is going to represent the required burn down to reach your goal, right? And then there's going to be an actual, right? So you're going to see two lines, and the actual is going to be what you're actually burning at the end of each day. And those lines are kind of compared, and they give you a simple measure of progress. It's quite easy to read, but there is one issue with burn down charts, and that is that it will not tell you or talk to you when there is scope change. So when there is work added or removed from the iteration, the burn down chart will not show you that. So burnup charts has that advantage, is that it will allow you to divide the scope and the progress, whereas in a burn down, it is all combined and it's not going to allow you the visualization and the identity changes in the scope or in the progress. So burnup charts essentially will, now the focus here is on how much work has been completed, right? So
Yeah.
now it will show you, again, the x-axis is time, y-axis is still points, but it's essentially showing you the information on your progress from bottom to top, right? So it really depends on what you're trying. Again, it's going to have those same two lines, but it really depends on what you're trying to track. For newer teams, they're trying to track, they should be tracking scope change, because that's something which comes in for teams which are doing new product development. Scope change should be tracked. So burn up charts in those situations are going to be more useful than burn down charts. When teams are more mature and typically there is not a lot of scope change, burn down charts give you a good trending, because you can essentially see what should be the ideal versus how are you trending against the ideal, right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
That's the difference.
Nice. So, and great question in the chat from our audience. They sent it to me privately, I guess. Is So we talked about grooming, but we talked about grooming at a team and story level, right? Um, our feet when we groom for PI, for features and epics, is that also considered grooming, or is there a separate name for that? And also, I'm going to combine the second question with it, is when teams are shared the features before going to the PI planning, right? They're given a list of features, and they have to come up with some stories. Most of the organizations do that. Is they'll have a list of features. Teams come up with stories before going to the PI planning, so they can plan accordingly, coming up with dependencies and calling out all those risks. Is that also considered part of grooming, or is there like separate activity that you put in place for that, Ram?
I think that should be part of the IP iteration, and that is why we always suggest that we should be reserving time for planning readiness, right? The PI planning is an important activity. So if you are doing scaled, any form of scaled, whether you call it big groom planning or PI planning, it's important to do some pre-planning activities, and all of the activities which the ask or mention should be part of that pre-planning readiness, right? And that should not be part of grooming, because grooming is done for iterations. That should be part of that pre-planning, which is that IP iteration, that first week of the IP. if you do have a 2-week IP iteration. And if you don't, then this is a reason why you should have one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great point. Yeah, I didn't even think about IP iteration when I saw the question. Good point, Rhea. Thank you for that. All right, so that brings us to the end of our questionnaire and our conversation today. If you guys have any other last minute questions, feel free to put in the chat. Um, Awais, do you have any last minute comments?
Uh, I think for the past 3 weeks we have been talking about user stories. I think we covered a lot of different aspects from a lot of different lenses. Uh, Again, the thing that we need to be mindful about is look at the team, see where the team is being comfortable, and to Reha's point, right, be humane about it, and what the team really needs. Pick up points from the retro, implement it, and it is a continuous learning process, and we need to iterate and improve continuously over the period of time. So there's like the first quarter the team could be doing something differently, they learn new things, depending on the initiatives they are working on, there could be a lot of changes, shifts. So don't don't be stuck to any one idea, but instead be very open, be agile, and continuously learn and evolve.
Awesome. All right, nice. Thank you, Awais. Rhea, do you have any last minute comments?
No, I think this has been great. I was not here in your last podcast, but I've had some great reviews, people reaching out and letting me know how useful this has been. So I'm hoping that the audience, and Rahul, I'm hoping you are uploading this 3-part podcast and our listeners are going to find more value. And of course, in the future, if you do have any questions around user stories, slicing, sizing, writing better stories, or any of these charts, there's so many resources out there, but also feel free to reach out to us. I think Rahul's contact information is available, or you can reach out to one of us through LinkedIn, and we'll be glad to help you. Daniel is here. He's wonderful. He's the king of user stories, and he's got so much information with him. So you've got a great set of coaches here, and we've got some of like Alicia. She's wonderful. I've seen her regularly through all of our podcasts. I think there's so much brain in this group right here. So it's important that if you do have questions, please reach out. Right? This is a great resource to tap onto.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rhea, for that. So that being said, we have been thinking about putting a workshop together for user story writing. So if you guys are interested, I put my email address down here in the chat. Feel free to ping me there so I can add you to the list. But other than that, what we're going to do is we're going to end this podcast now. But if you guys want to stay after the podcast, have a few questions for the next 5 minutes, feel free to do that. Other than that, I will see you guys next week. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Reha. Thank you, Awais.
Thank you, guys.